The screaming stopped at exactly 3:47 a.m. on October 13th, 1856, not with a sudden cut, but a slow, ragged exhalation that seemed to draw the very last tendrils of warmth from the pre-dawn air. The silence that followed was a physical thing, pressing down on the isolated Appalachian cabin, a heavy shroud woven from pine needles and the damp chill of the mountainside. It clung to the rough-hewn timbers, seeped through the cracks, and settled like a fine layer of ash upon everything within, including the few, still figures gathered in the dim parlor. This was not the silence of peace, but of an end, of a struggle finally lost, and of something profound and deeply unsettling having irrevocably changed. If the forgotten echoes of such stark histories draw your gaze, and this is your first time encountering our archive, consider subscribing to join our journey through the veiled past. Dr. Samuel Harding, a man whose hands were as accustomed to the delicate precision of a surgeon's scalpel as they were to the rough reins of his mare, arrived as the first hesitant rays of a steel-gray dawn began to fracture the horizon. His journey up the winding, barely there path had been made under a sky the color of bruised plums, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. He had been summoned by a young man, a distant cousin of the family he now faced, whose words had been few and clipped, spoken with a nervous energy that suggested less urgency and more a profound, unsettling reluctance. Samuel had noted the way the messenger had kept his eyes fixed on the middle distance, avoiding any direct gaze, a common trait in these remote valleys where old ways clung like stubborn moss to ancient stones. His own family, though now settled closer to the burgeoning town of Blackwood Creek, had roots deep within these very hills, a lineage he sometimes found himself tracing back through forgotten names and unmarked graves. He remembered his grandmother, a woman of quiet strength and sharper wit, telling him tales of these isolated communities, stories tinged with both admiration for their resilience and a subtle, unspoken warning about their insular nature. The parlor was small, stifling, and suffocatingly warm, despite the chill seeping in from outside. A single beeswax candle, guttering in a heavy brass holder, cast long, dancing shadows that stretched and contorted the already grim faces of the family members huddled near the cold hearth. The air was thick with the cloying sweetness of fading lilies, brought in to mask the inescapable scent of illness and the metallic tang that often lingered after a prolonged struggle with death. Samuel's gaze, trained to observe, took in the details, the rough-spun clothes, patched and mended, the deep lines etched into the faces of the two elderly women by the fire, their eyes, dark and unreadable, following his every movement. He noticed the way their hands, gnarled and calloused, clutched at each other, a silent pact of grief and something else, something less definable, a tension that hummed beneath the surface of their somber acceptance. The room itself felt ancient, not merely old, but as if it had absorbed generations of whispered secrets and unexpressed sorrows into its very beams. The floorboards creaked under his weight, a mournful sound that echoed the unspoken grief that permeated the space, a grief that seemed less about loss and more about a grim inevitability. He approached the crude pine casket, placed upon a simple trestle table in the center of the room. The wood was unvarnished, still smelling faintly of the forest from which it had been cut, a stark, unadorned vessel for what lay within. As he drew closer, the dim light of the candle flickered, momentarily obscuring the small form, then revealing it with a stark, unforgiving clarity. It was a child, no more than 6 or 7 years of age, laid out in a simple white shift, hands clasped over a wilted sprig of wildflowers. The face, partially obscured by shadow, seemed unnaturally serene, a stillness that was often the first indication of a difficult passing. Samuel had witnessed countless deaths in his years as a physician, from the sudden, violent ends of logging accidents to the slow, agonizing decline of consumption. Each, in its own way, left a mark, but none had ever prepared him for the sight that now confronted him in the silent, candle-lit parlor. He leaned closer, his medical bag, well-worn leather and brass, placed silently on the floor beside him. He reached out a gloved hand, gently moving aside a lock of fine, pale hair from the child's forehead. The skin was unnaturally translucent, almost alabaster in the dim light, stretched tautly over delicate bones. He noted the fine network of blue veins visible beneath the surface, a common enough sight in a child so fair. Yet, as his eyes adjusted, and the candlelight seemed to gather itself, focusing its meager illumination, the first irregularity manifested itself. The eyes, though closed, seemed sunken, almost hollowed out beneath brows that were too prominent for such a small face. The bridge of the nose, typically a delicate curve in children, was remarkably flat, almost recessed. His trained gaze, usually so clinical, registered a flicker of something akin to unease. He had seen malformations before, the cruel twists of fate that sometimes manifested in the vulnerable frame of a newborn, but this was different. This bore the hallmarks of a profound internal struggle, etched onto the very architecture of the child's face. His examination continued, methodical and detached, yet beneath the professional facade, a growing disquiet began to coalesce. He gently lifted one of the child's small, cold hands. The fingers were slender, almost too long, and unusually flexible, bending at angles that seemed unnatural. He noticed the faint, barely perceptible webbing between the digits, a subtle adhesion that hinted at something deeper than mere physical anomaly. He felt for the pulse, a futile gesture, but a habitual one, a final acknowledgement of the life that had departed. The skin felt cool, almost waxy, and as he gently turned the hand over, he saw that the nails were surprisingly thick, almost horny in texture, rather than the delicate, translucent crescents one would expect. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through him. This was not a simple matter of birth defect. It was a complex tapestry of irregularities woven through the entire physical form. He carefully lifted the edge of the shift, revealing the small chest. The ribs seemed to protrude with an unsettling sharpness, forming a prominent ridge, and the abdomen was slightly distended, though not painfully so, suggesting an internal complexity. He noted the unusual curvature of the spine, a subtle scoliosis that seemed to pull the frame inward, giving the child an almost fetal aspect, even in death. The limbs, though slight, seemed disproportionately short for the torso, creating an overall impression of a body that had been compressed, molded by an unseen, powerful force. Each detail, observed in isolation, might have been dismissed as a singular, tragic misfortune, but together, they painted a portrait of a profound disfigurement, a systemic failure of natural development that defied simple explanation. Samuel's mind, accustomed to the logical framework of anatomical knowledge, found itself struggling to categorize, to understand. As he concluded his examination, the silence in the parlor deepened, punctuated only by the occasional crackle of the candle wick. The family members, still by the hearth, had remained motionless, their eyes fixed on him, their expressions unreadable, a blend of stoicism and an ancient, resigned sorrow. No one spoke, no one offered an explanation, no one even shed a tear. It was as if this death, and the physical manifestation of its cause, was an expected, if tragic, outcome. This quiet acceptance was, in itself, unsettling, a silent testament to a history Samuel could not yet fathom. He straightened, letting the shift fall back into place, covering the small, twisted form. The cold weight of the room settled on him once more, and he felt a profound weariness, a sense of encountering something beyond his purview as a physician. A knock on the cabin door, gentle but insistent, broke the spell. It was the itinerant daguerreotypist, a man named Phineas, a tall, gaunt figure with precise, almost surgical movements. He carried his heavy wooden camera with an almost reverent care, his eyes, magnified behind thick spectacles, darting around the room, taking in the scene with a professional, yet distinctly uncomfortable, air. Phineas was known for his steady hand and his uncanny ability to capture a fleeting moment, a talent highly valued in these remote communities where a photograph was often the only lasting memento of a loved one. He set up his cumbersome equipment with practiced ease, the gleaming brass of the lens reflecting the candlelight, casting momentary flashes of light that danced across the somber faces of the family. The air filled with the faint chemical scent of collodion and silver, a potent perfume of preservation and permanence. The family had requested the daguerreotype, a common enough practice for children, particularly those who had not lived long enough to leave many memories. But Samuel knew, instinctively, that this photograph was different. It was not merely a memento, it was documentation. It would preserve, in its stark, unblinking clarity, the image of a child unlike any other he had encountered. Phineas worked in silence, adjusting the focus, arranging the light, his movements precise and unhurried. He draped a black cloth over his head, disappearing momentarily behind the camera, a silent observer of a profoundly private grief. The flash, when it came, was not a sudden burst of light, but a softer, more prolonged exposure, the silvered plate slowly gathering the reflected light, etching the image onto its surface with an almost spectral fidelity. During the long exposure, a profound stillness descended upon the parlor, deeper and more resonant than before. The very air seemed to hold its breath. Samuel stood back, observing the scene with a detached fascination, his mind already cataloging, questioning. He noticed the way the family members, though still, seemed to subtly shift, their gazes never quite meeting, always directed slightly away, as if avoiding the full weight of the scene. It was a silence born not just of mourning, but of a deeper, more ingrained habit of concealment. What secrets did this family harbor beneath their stoic facades and their remote existence? What unspoken truths did they guard, passed down through generations like cherished, if burdensome, heirlooms? As Phineas carefully removed the plate, retreating to a small, makeshift dark room in the corner of the parlor, the family remained silent, their eyes following the precious plate as if it contained not just an image, but a piece of their very souls. Samuel, however, felt a different kind of pull. His medical training had given him a profound respect for the human form, its resilience, its intricate design, but what he had just witnessed defied that understanding. This was not merely a child. This was a testament to something profoundly amiss, a deviation from the natural order that spoke of generations of insidious corruption. The irregularities he had noted were too numerous, too interconnected, to be random. They spoke of a pattern, a lineage twisted inward on itself, a family tree that looked more like a thorn bush, its branches looping back, feeding on its own heartwood. The daguerreotype, once developed, would be more than a photograph. It would be a chilling record, a silent scream frozen in silver, a testament to a truth that was only just beginning to reveal itself. The silence that followed the daguerreotype's capture in the small, oppressive parlor was not an empty one, but rather a dense, palpable thing, heavy with unspoken histories. It clung to the rough-hewn walls and permeated the very fabric of the air, a silent testament to a life lived far from the common gaze. Dr. Samuel Harding, his medical bag still resting beside him, found his professional detachment beginning to fray. His gaze, no longer fixed solely on the deceased child, now drifted to the living members of the family, and what he saw only deepened his growing unease. Their faces, uniformly pale beneath the soot-stained candlelight, shared a striking, almost unsettling similarity. High cheekbones, often narrow and sharp, were common, but here they seemed exaggerated, almost too pronounced for the soft flesh that typically covered them. Their eyes, dark and deep-set, held a peculiar, unblinking intensity, a gaze that seemed to penetrate without truly engaging. He noted the pronounced prognathism, a subtle jut of the jawline that, in some, was barely discernible, but in others, particularly an elderly woman seated closest to the hearth, gave her face a slack, almost canine aspect. Her lower lip, thick and perpetually moist, seemed to hang slightly open, revealing a glimpse of uneven teeth, yellowed with age and neglect. It was a detail that, in isolation, might have been dismissed as the wear and tear of a hard life, but when viewed as part of a collective physiognomy, it coalesced into something more significant, more troubling. Her hands, gnarled and powerful, rested on a walking stick carved from unpeeled hickory, its surface smoothed by decades of constant contact. The very air around them seemed to thicken, imbued with the scent of wood smoke, damp wool, and an underlying musk that was neither unpleasant nor distinctly human, but rather an earthy, primal odor. Their dialect, when spoken, was a further source of disquiet. It was not merely the broad, regional accent common to the deep valleys of Appalachia, but something older, more isolated. Words were clipped, syllables sometimes swallowed whole, and the rhythm of their speech was halting, almost guttural. When the elderly woman by the fire finally spoke, her voice a dry rasp, she merely stated that the child had been ailing since the last frost. Her words were directed not at Samuel, but at an unseen point beyond him, as if speaking to the very air, or to an internal narrative only she could truly understand. No further explanation was offered, no details of the illness, no lamentations of the suffering. It was a statement of stark, irrefutable fact, delivered with the same somber finality as the closing of a coffin lid. Samuel recognized this pattern of speech, this laconic brevity, as characteristic of isolated communities, where unspoken understandings often carried more weight than articulated sentences. Yet, here, it felt less like tradition and more like a deliberate barrier, a wall of silence erected to keep outsiders at bay. Whispers had always circulated about these remote families, rumors carried down from the higher ridges by hunters and trappers who occasionally ventured into the deeper hollows. Tales of cousin marrying cousin, of bloodlines so tangled they resembled a Gordian knot, were not uncommon in the isolated mountain communities. These were often dismissed as idle gossip, exaggerations spun by those who feared what they did not understand. Yet, as Samuel stood amidst this family, observing their physical uniformity and their unsettling silence, the whispers began to take on a chilling resonance. He recalled an old saying from his grandmother, a phrase delivered with a knowing glance and a slight shake of her head. When a family keeps too much to itself, the blood runs thin, and the mind runs wild. The phrase, once a quaint folk saying, now struck him with the force of a premonition. He considered the implications of such practices, the scientific understanding of which was still nascent in his time, yet the observed consequences were clear enough. Generations of intermarriage, an incestuous loop, could only lead to a genetic collapse, a weakening of the very blueprint of life. The child in the casket was not merely an anomaly, it was a symptom, a stark, undeniable manifestation of a deeper, systemic rot. His mind, usually so rational, found itself grasping at metaphors, attempting to categorize what felt unclassifiable. The family tree, he mused, did not branch outwards, reaching for the sky, but rather curled back upon itself, a self-sustaining, self-consuming entity, more akin to a parasitic growth than a healthy lineage. The very idea sent a shiver down his spine, a cold premonition of truths yet to be unearthed. The family lived on a small, hardscrabble farm, clinging to the side of a steep hollow, accessible only by a single, winding track that barely deserved the name of road. Beyond the cabin, a few weather-beaten outbuildings sagged under the weight of time and neglect. Further up the slope, amidst a stand of ancient, gnarled oaks, Samuel noticed a small, unmarked graveyard. It was little more than a patch of disturbed earth, dotted with rough-hewn stones, many bearing no inscriptions, others with only crude, hand-scratched initials, barely legible beneath layers of lichen and moss. The absence of names, dates, or even simple epitaphs spoke volumes, hinting at a desire for anonymity, a deliberate erasure of individual identity in favor of a collective, familial existence. The stones themselves seemed to hunch, bowed by the weight of the stories they refused to tell, silent sentinels guarding the secrets of the dead. Phineas, the daguerreotypist, emerged from his makeshift darkroom, carefully holding the freshly prepared plate. His usual professional demeanor was subtly altered. His movements, though still precise, seemed imbued with a new, almost frantic energy, and his eyes, behind the thick lenses, held a distinct glimmer of unease. He avoided looking directly at the family members, his gaze sweeping across their faces only momentarily before settling on the inanimate object of his craft. He offered the plate, encased in its velvet-lined frame, to the matriarch of the family, a woman whose face was a roadmap of etched lines and whose hair was the color of dried bone. She took it with a slow, deliberate movement, her gnarled fingers tracing the outline of the frame, her eyes, for the first time, betraying a flicker of something Samuel could almost interpret as triumph. It was a brief, almost imperceptible moment, but it solidified Samuel's growing conviction that this was not merely a record of a death, but a testament, an artifact of a profound and unsettling lineage. As Phineas prepared to depart, his reluctance to linger was almost palpable. He exchanged a brief, almost whispered word with Samuel, his voice low and strained. He merely stated that the light had been difficult, a common enough complaint from photographers, but the tremor in his hands as he packed his equipment suggested a deeper discomfort, an unease that went beyond technical challenges. His eyes met Samuel's for a fleeting moment, and in them, Samuel saw a reflection of his own burgeoning questions, a silent acknowledgement of the disturbing nature of what they had both witnessed. The daguerreotypist's hurried exit, his almost desperate desire to put distance between himself and the cabin, spoke volumes, a silent warning against lingering too long in the shadow of such a profound and unsettling silence. Samuel remained for a time, ostensibly to ensure the family had all they needed, but in truth, a deeper compulsion held him fast. He walked around the small cabin, noting the crude symbols carved into the doorframe, ancient protective marks against unseen evils, yet here they seemed less like safeguards and more like desperate entreaties. The very air around the house seemed to hum with a low, almost imperceptible vibration, a sense of deep, ingrained isolation that had shaped not only the lives within, but the very land around it. The whispers of the villagers, now distant echoes in his memory, began to crystallize into a more concrete understanding. The family was not merely isolated. They were self-contained, a closed system, a biological loop that had, over generations, begun to feed upon itself, slowly and irrevocably. The stillness of those who lived by their own rules, Samuel realized, was not a sign of peace, but a profound, almost dangerous equilibrium. Their very existence was an anomaly, a testament to traditions that defied the outside world, a refusal to engage with anything beyond their immediate, shrinking circle. The child in the daguerreotype was the stark, unblinking proof of this self-imposed isolation, a physical manifestation of a lineage that had turned inward, becoming both perpetrator and victim of its own long-held secrets. The question that now gnawed at Samuel was not merely what had caused the child's deformities, but how long this family had hidden the true, profound cost of their secrecy. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the answers lay not just in the observable anomalies, but in the unseen currents of their history, a history he now felt compelled to unearth, starting with the dry, undeniable facts held within official records. Dr. Samuel Harding's descent from the mountain hollow felt like a journey between worlds, a slow, deliberate passage from a realm of unspoken rules and ancient shadows into the more structured, if equally unforgiving, world of man-made law and recorded history. The air, heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth, gradually gave way to the smell of coal smoke and civilization as he approached the county seat of Blackwood Creek. The town, with its orderly grid of streets and its imposing brick courthouse, stood in stark contrast to the tangled, organic chaos of the mountains he had just left behind. It was here, within the dusty, silent archives of the courthouse, that he hoped to find the logic, the pattern, that could explain the small, twisted body he had examined in the candlelit parlor. He sought not to condemn, but to understand, to map the lineage that had produced such a tragic and unsettling result, believing that the cold, dispassionate language of official records could illuminate what the family's guarded silence had so effectively concealed. The county clerk, a man named Thaddeus, was a creature of the archives, a slight, balding figure whose world was circumscribed by the leather-bound ledgers and stacked deed boxes that filled his office from floor to ceiling. His one small, almost unconscious habit was the constant, meticulous polishing of his spectacles with a small square of chamois cloth, a gesture that seemed to extend to his entire worldview. He sought clarity, order, and the proper filing of all things. When Samuel presented his request, a general inquiry into the genealogical records of a particular family line from the High Hollows, Thaddeus paused his polishing, his pale eyes narrowing slightly. He informed Samuel, in a voice as dry as old parchment, that such records were often incomplete, that families in the outer territories were notoriously lax in their reporting of births, deaths, and marriages. Yet, he did not refuse. There was a flicker of professional pride in his demeanor, a quiet satisfaction in the belief that within his meticulously organized domain, all that could be known was, in fact, present. He led Samuel into a small windowless room at the back of the courthouse, a vault of forgotten histories where the air was still and thick with the scent of decaying paper and bookbinder's glue. Dust motes danced in the single beam of light from Samuel's oil lamp, illuminating towering shelves laden with enormous, brass-clasped volumes. Thaddeus, with a librarian's practiced efficiency, located the relevant baptismal and marriage ledgers, their leather covers cracked and their spines brittle with age. He laid them upon a heavy oak table, the sound of their weight a dull thud that seemed to echo through the decades. He then retreated, leaving Samuel to his grim archaeology, the unspoken understanding between them being that some doors, once opened, could not easily be closed again. Samuel began with the most recent baptismal records, his gloved fingers tracing the elegant spidery script of the parish priests who had, for generations, made the arduous journey into the mountains. He found the entry for the deceased child, A simple, unadorned line, a first name, Silas's, followed by the family surname, the date of birth, and the names of the parents. He noted the mother's name, Orpah, and the father's, Zebulon. He then began the slow, painstaking process of moving backward in time, tracing the family line through the yellowed, foxed pages of the ledger. The first sign of the closed circle appeared within an hour. He found the baptismal record for Orpah, the mother. Her parents were listed as Keziah and Jotham. A few pages later, he found the record for Zebulon, the father. His mother was also named Keziah. His father was a man named Enoch. A cold knot began to form in Samuel's stomach. The two mothers, both named Keziah, were not a coincidence. He suspected they were one and the same. He cross-referenced the dates. The birth years for Orpah and Zebulon were only 3 years apart. It was entirely possible, probable even, that they were half-siblings, sharing a mother. The rumors of cousin marriage, which had seemed like provincial gossip, now felt like a gross understatement. He was not looking at a family tree, but a suffocating, tangled web. He pushed deeper into the records, his lamp casting a small, warm pool of light on the cold, damning facts. The same handful of biblical, uncommon names appeared again and again: Mahalah, Hephzibah, Azariah, Jeduthun. They were recycled through the generations, appearing as parents, children, and godparents with a dizzying, claustrophobic frequency. The lineage did not branch. It folded back upon itself, a serpent consuming its own tail. He moved to the marriage ledgers, his sense of clinical detachment now fully supplanted by a growing dread. The paper trail here was even more explicit, more damning. He found the marriage entry for Keziah. She had first married Jotham. A decade later, following Jotham's death from what the record cryptically termed a wasting fever, she had married Enoch, Jotham's own first cousin. Her 2 children, Orpah and Zebulon, born of 2 different fathers who were themselves closely related, had then gone on to marry each other, producing the child, Silas, who now lay in the pine casket. The incestuous loop was complete, documented in the elegant, unjudging script of a long-dead priest. The records did not whisper, they screamed. They provided a cold, factual cartography of genetic collapse, a lineage so insular that it had become a self-contained, self-perpetuating engine of its own decline. Samuel sat back, the sheer documented reality of it washing over him. The physical deformities of the child were no longer a mystery, they were an inevitability. He felt a wave of profound, sorrowful pity, not just for the deceased child, but for the entire lineage, trapped in a cycle of tradition and isolation that had led them to this biological dead end. He imagined generations living and dying in that remote hollow, their world shrinking with each successive insular union, their genetic heritage growing more and more brittle until it finally produced a child whose body simply could not hold the weight of such a corrupted inheritance. The silence of the family was not born of stoicism, he now understood, but of a deep, perhaps even unconscious, shame, a communal understanding of a truth so profound and so terrible that it could never be spoken aloud. Driven by a morbid, scholarly curiosity, he turned his attention to the mortality tables, the starkest records of all. Here, the story of the family's decline was told in brief, brutal entries. Alongside the family surname, he found an alarmingly high incidence of infant and child deaths. The pages were a litany of small tragedies. Unnamed infant, stillborn, Mahalah, died of summer fever, age 1 year. Azariah, wasting sickness, age 3 years. For every child that survived to adulthood, it seemed 2 or 3 others perished in infancy. It was a brutal testament to a weakened bloodline, a genetic pool so shallow that it could no longer effectively fight off the common ailments of childhood. The survival of the fittest had, in this isolated hollow, become a grim lottery, with the odds stacked heavily against each new generation. The child, Silas, had simply been the latest, and perhaps the most extreme, casualty in a long, undeclared war against nature itself. As he was preparing to close the final ledger, Thaddeus reappeared, his spectacles gleaming in the lamplight. He inquired if Dr. Harding had found what he was looking for. Samuel, unsure how to articulate the grotesque tapestry he had uncovered, merely nodded. Thaddeus, misinterpreting his silence as frustration, offered a final, strange piece of anecdotal evidence. He mentioned that hunters and trappers, men who knew the deep woods as well as Thaddeus knew his archives, had for years spoken of strange findings on the lands belonging to that particular family. They reported seeing small, carefully tended graves far from the main family plot, marked with the same crude, carved stones. The graves, they said, were too small for even a child, yet too deliberate for any animal. They spoke of finding the remains of livestock, sheep and calves, buried with an almost ritualistic care, their bodies sometimes showing signs of the same physical twists and malformations seen in the family's own tragically short-lived children. The clerk delivered this information in his usual dry, factual tone, as if reporting on a property dispute or a tax record, but the implication of his words hung in the dusty air, a chilling addendum to the documented history. It hinted at something darker than mere tradition, a level of awareness, perhaps even a desperate, superstitious attempt to understand or control the decay that was consuming them from within. Were these animal graves offerings, experiments, a grim recognition of a shared affliction that transcended the barrier between human and beast? The written records, for all their damning clarity, could not answer these questions. They could expose a lineage more corrupt than rumor had ever dared to suggest, but they fell silent at the edge of the family's deepest, most closely guarded secrets. The paper trail had confirmed the what of the family's decline, but the why remained shrouded in the mountain mists. A dark and unsettling mystery that was now beginning to feel less like a historical inquiry and more like a present danger. The knowledge gleaned from the county archives settled upon Dr. Samuel Harding like a physical weight, a shroud of documented history that was heavier than any mere superstition. He found himself unable to simply close the file, to consign the family and their tragic lineage to the cold, impersonal record of the past. A grim, almost professional obligation compelled him to return, not with the intention of confrontation, but with a need to witness the living remnants of this genetic collapse, to see with his own eyes the ongoing consequences of generations of insularity. His return journey, made a week after the funeral, was different. The path seemed narrower, the woods on either side more menacing, the silence of the mountains no longer peaceful but imbued with a watchful, waiting quality. He was no longer just a physician making a house call. He was an archivist who had read the final, damning chapter of a story whose subjects were, unsettlingly, still alive. As he approached the clearing where the cabin stood, a movement at the edge of the woods caught his eye. Two small children, a boy and a girl, stood partially concealed behind the thick trunk of a sycamore tree. They were unnervingly still, their pale, round faces turned towards him, their eyes wide and dark in the dappled sunlight. He recognized the same slack jawline, the same slightly recessed bridge of the nose that he had observed in the deceased child. Their expressions were utterly blank, devoid of the natural curiosity or shyness one would expect from children encountering a stranger. It was a profound, unnerving emptiness, a vacuity that suggested minds that were not merely simple, but fundamentally unfinished. They did not wave, they did not run. They simply watched, their gazes as flat and unreflective as pools of stagnant water. The silence that emanated from them was not the quiet of well-behaved children, but the deep, internal silence of beings disconnected from the world around them. Samuel offered a slow, deliberate nod, a gesture meant to be reassuring, but it elicited no response. The children remained as motionless as the trees that surrounded them, their small, pale forms seeming to blend into the gray bark of the sycamores. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. It was the unnerving sensation of being observed not by human children, but by something more elemental, something that possessed the shape of humanity but lacked its essential spark. He remembered the hunters' tales, the whispers of pale, fleeting figures seen in the deep woods, and he wondered if it was these children, these living remnants, who had inspired such unsettling folklore. Were they merely malformed, or had the long, slow decay of their bloodline produced something that was, in some fundamental way, less than human and perhaps more than animal? He dismounted, tethering his horse to a low-hanging branch, and approached the cabin. The front door was slightly ajar, a dark, vertical slash in the weathered wood. As he drew closer, a smell reached him, a scent that was both familiar and deeply wrong. It was the coppery, metallic odor of blood, but not the clean, fresh scent of a butcher's shop or a recent wound. This was a spoiled, slightly sweet smell, the scent of old blood, of something that had been left to congeal and decay in a closed space. It emanated from the house in a faint but persistent miasma, clinging to the air, a foul perfume that spoke of sickness and neglect. It was a smell that turned his stomach, a primal warning of contamination and deep, systemic uncleanliness. He knocked on the heavy oak door, the sound unnaturally loud in the profound quiet of the hollow. There was no answer, only a faint shuffling from within, a sound like dry leaves being scuttled across a wooden floor. He called out, announcing his name and purpose, stating that he had come to check on the family's welfare. The shuffling stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, a void of sound that seemed to absorb his voice. He pushed the door open a little wider. The interior of the cabin was dark, the single window shuttered, trapping the gloom within. The air was thick with the smell of spoiled blood and unwashed bodies, a suffocating atmosphere that was almost physically repellent. In the dim light, he could just make out the form of the matriarch, the old woman with the canine jaw, sitting in her rocking chair by the cold hearth, her eyes, two dark pools in her wrinkled face, fixed upon him. She said nothing, her stillness a silent, unyielding wall of hostility. Her hands, resting on the arms of the chair, were curled into tight arthritic fists. Samuel took a hesitant step inside, his eyes slowly adjusting to the gloom. He could see now that the floor was bare and grimy, the few pieces of furniture crude and functional. There was no sign of the other family members, only the old woman, a silent, malevolent sentinel guarding the secrets of the house. He began to speak, his voice sounding strained and artificial in the oppressive atmosphere. He explained that he had reviewed the county records, that he understood the family had suffered many losses, and that as a physician, he felt a duty to offer what help he could. The old woman's expression did not change, but a low sound began to emanate from her throat, a guttural, almost animalistic growl. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated menace, a warning that transcended language. She told him, her voice a dry, rasping whisper, that their ways were not his concern. She said that the mountains provided for their own, and that his city medicine had no place here. Her words were few, but they carried the weight of an unshakable, ancient conviction. It was the voice of a tradition so deeply ingrained that it had become a biological imperative, a closed loop of belief that mirrored the closed loop of their bloodline. He realized then that his presence was not merely an intrusion, it was a threat, a violation of the profound isolation that had both sustained and destroyed them. As he backed away, his professional composure giving way to a more primal instinct for self-preservation, his gaze fell upon a small wooden bucket in the corner of the room. It was from this bucket that the foul smell seemed to be strongest. A dark, viscous liquid stained its sides, and a swarm of black flies buzzed lazily around its rim. The sight, combined with the old woman's palpable hostility, solidified a new, even more terrifying suspicion in his mind. The hunters had spoken of animal graves, of livestock born with the same afflictions as the children. What if the family's desperate attempts to understand their plight had taken a darker, more proactive turn? What if they were not merely observing the decay, but actively participating in it, seeking answers or remedies in ways that defied all medical and moral understanding? His retreat from the cabin was slow and deliberate, his eyes never leaving the dark, unblinking stare of the old woman. The two children were still by the sycamore tree, their pale faces turning to follow his departure, their expressions as blank and unreadable as before. The encounter had moved the story from the realm of historical suspicion to one of immediate, palpable terror. The decay was not just in their blood, it was in their home, in their minds, in the very air they breathed. It was an active, malevolent force, and he had just stared into its heart. His journey back to Blackwood Creek was fueled by a new sense of urgency, the apathetic, almost feral nature of the survivors, the foul stench of the cabin, the old woman's undisguised menace. It all pointed to a situation that was spiraling beyond mere tragedy and into the realm of active horror. As he rode into the outskirts of town, he was intercepted by a man on horseback, the county overseer, a stern, pragmatic individual named Titus, whose authority in the outlying territories was absolute. Titus had evidently been waiting for him. He informed Samuel, in a tone that brooked no argument, that his inquiries into the family had been noted. He warned him, with a cold, final finality, to stop. Titus stated that some families, and some parts of the mountains, were best left to their own devices. He spoke of a long-standing, unspoken agreement to leave the family in their isolation, a policy born less of compassion and more of a deep-seated fear of what they represented. He said that stirring up the past would do no good, that it would only bring trouble to the town and to Samuel himself. The overseer's warning was not a suggestion. It was an order, backed by the full weight of county law and, more importantly, by the unwritten code of the mountains. Samuel was being told, in no uncertain terms, that the curtain of secrecy that had shielded the family for generations was to be drawn closed once more. The system was not broken. It was designed to function this way, to contain the horror, to let it burn itself out in the isolated darkness of the hollow. But Samuel knew that the fire was not dying out. It was merely smoldering, and the photograph he had witnessed being taken, the Daguerreotype, was now the only remaining proof of its terrible, enduring flame. The county overseer's warning echoed in Dr. Samuel Harding's mind for days, a cold and pragmatic decree that clashed violently with the haunting images now seared into his memory. The blank, empty stares of the surviving children, the palpable menace of the matriarch, the cloying, sweet smell of decay that clung to the cabin. These were not things a man of science and conscience could simply set aside. Titus's edict, meant to quarantine the horror, had instead sharpened Samuel's focus, transforming his professional curiosity into a desperate, almost obsessive need to leave behind some definitive record of what he had uncovered. He was a man accustomed to the clear, logical progression of diagnosis and treatment, but here, the disease was not in an individual, but in a lineage, and the only treatment was the stark, unblinking truth. he felt a profound, almost crushing sense of responsibility to ensure that the story of the child, Silas, did not simply vanish back into the mountain mists, absorbed into the silent, complicit history of the Hollow. His thoughts returned, again and again, to the one piece of irrefutable evidence that existed outside the dusty, ambiguous pages of the county ledgers, the Daguerreotype. The photograph, he knew, would be an unassailable witness, its silvered surface holding a perfect, pitiless reflection of the truth. It was a testament that could not be dismissed as rumor or folklore. He found himself consumed by the need to see it one last time, to study its details away from the oppressive, candle-lit gloom of the parlor, to examine it under the clear, analytical light of his own study. He needed to confirm that what he had seen was not a product of shadow and fear, but a cold, physical reality. He sent a polite, carefully worded message to Phineas, the itinerant photographer, requesting an opportunity to view the plate, framing it as a matter of medical curiosity, a desire to better understand a rare congenital condition. Phineas's reply was hesitant, delivered by a nervous young boy who seemed eager to be quit of the task. The photographer agreed to a meeting, but not at his own lodgings. Instead, he proposed a discreet rendezvous in a quiet corner of the town's only tavern, a place where their conversation would be swallowed by the general murmur of commerce and drink. When Samuel arrived, he found Phineas huddled over a small, cloth-wrapped parcel on the table, his shoulders hunched, his eyes darting nervously around the room. The man's professional composure had entirely dissolved, replaced by the raw, undisguised fear of someone who had peered into a darkness from which he could not look away. He confessed to Samuel in a hushed, trembling voice that the image he had captured had haunted his sleep, that the child's face, frozen in its serene, unnatural stillness, seemed to watch him from the developing chemicals. With hands that shook almost uncontrollably, Phineas unwrapped the parcel. The Daguerreotype, in its ornate, velvet-lined case, seemed to absorb the tavern's dim lamplight, its polished surface a small, dark mirror. He slid it across the table to Samuel. In the clearer light, the details were even more stark, more medically precise than Samuel remembered. The flattened bridge of the nose, the unusual length of the fingers, the subtle, almost imperceptible webbing between them, every single anomaly was captured with a chilling scientific clarity. The photograph was a perfect, silent autopsy, a detailed map of a genetic catastrophe. It was, without question, the most profoundly disturbing artifact Samuel had ever held. It was not just a portrait of a deceased child. It was the final, damning evidence of a lineage that had deliberately and systematically turned its back on the natural order. As Samuel studied the image, his trained eye tracing the lines of the child's form, his thumb brushed against the ornate metal frame of the Daguerreotype case, he felt something rough, a small, almost imperceptible irregularity on the smooth, cool surface of the silvered plate itself, near the bottom edge. He tilted the photograph, angling it so that the lamplight caught it just so, his breath caught in his throat, scratched directly into the delicate, chemical surface of the image in a crude, almost childlike hand, were 3 stark words. They were not part of the photographer's process. They were a defacement, a secret message scratched into the very fabric of the evidence by an unseen hand. The words were a ragged, desperate whisper from the past, a final, chilling piece of testimony. They read, "Not born, made." The 3 words struck Samuel with the force of a physical blow. They recontextualized everything he had discovered, shifting the narrative from a passive tragedy of genetic decay to an active, unthinkable horror. Made. The word suggested intent, a deliberate process, a conscious act of creation. It implied that the child was not simply the unfortunate, inevitable outcome of generations of inbreeding, but something else entirely, something engineered. The animal graves, the strange, ritualistic burials, the spoiled blood in the cabin, these disparate, unsettling details suddenly coalesced into a monstrous, terrifying new hypothesis. What if the family had not been merely enduring their decline, but had been actively experimenting with it, trying to guide it, to shape it, to create something from their own corrupted flesh? The question was so profoundly monstrous that his mind recoiled from it, yet the evidence, scratched into the plate before him, was undeniable. Phineas, seeing the look of horror on Samuel's face, leaned forward, his voice a barely audible whisper. He said that he had only noticed the inscription himself a few days after developing the plate. He confessed that he believed it had been done in the moments after he had presented the finished daguerreotype to the family, perhaps by one of the silent, older women while his back was turned. He had wanted to destroy the plate, to burn the case and grind the silvered image to dust, but a part of him, a small, stubborn kernel of professional duty, had refused. He knew that what he had captured was important, a piece of a story that needed to be told, even if he did not understand its full, terrifying scope. He pushed the cased photograph back toward Samuel, his hands recoiling as if from a hot coal. He told Samuel to take it, that he wanted no part of it, that the $20 the family had paid him felt like blood money. Samuel left the tavern, the weight of the daguerreotype in his coat pocket, a cold, heavy presence against his chest. The overseer's warning, once a pragmatic piece of political advice, now seemed like a desperate attempt to contain a truth far more terrible than mere incest. The family was not just hiding a secret, they were guarding a process, a dark and unnatural tradition that had moved beyond passive acceptance and into the realm of active creation. The child in the photograph was not a victim of circumstance, but a product, a creation, an artifact of a deeply twisted, horrifyingly deliberate act. That night, under the solitary glow of his office lamp, Samuel Harding began to write. He filled page after page of his personal ledger, his script, usually so precise and clinical, now a frantic, urgent scrawl. He documented everything, his initial examination of the child's body, the stoic, unsettling silence of the family, the damning evidence of the county archives, the blank stares of the living children, and finally, the three terrifying words scratched into the surface of the daguerreotype. He was no longer just a physician or a historian, he was a witness, and he knew with a chilling certainty that his testimony was a dangerous thing to possess. 2 days later, Dr. Samuel Harding vanished. There was no sign of a struggle in his office, no note, no indication of where he had gone. His horse was still in its stable, his medical bag on its hook by the door. The only thing out of place was his personal ledger. It was found on the cold granite steps of the county courthouse at dawn, left there by an unknown person. The book was open to the last page of his frantic entry, the ink still fresh. A single dark, bloody thumbprint was smeared across the bottom of the page, a crude and final signature. Of the doctor himself, nothing was ever found. He was simply gone, absorbed into the same silent, watchful wilderness that had birthed the family he had tried so desperately to understand. The daguerreotype also disappeared from the official record. It was not logged as evidence, not filed away in the courthouse archives. It slipped through the cracks of history, its existence becoming a thing of local legend, a ghost story whispered on long winter nights. Decades later, it would surface in a private collection, its provenance murky, its story fragmented. Modern researchers, debating its authenticity, would point to the crude inscription as possible proof of a hoax. But for those who knew the deep history of the mountains, For those who had heard the old whispers and understood the profound, suffocating power of isolation, the photograph remained what it had always been. The final, chilling testament of Dr. Samuel Harding and the enduring, silent evidence of a horror that was not simply born, but deliberately, terrifyingly made.